Hello everyone, Joel here. Welcome to Now Let's Fix This. Today we're going to talk about basic wiring, and then we're going to progress into how it goes into the house from the service panel, or what we call electrical panel, and into the outlets and so forth. So for this segment here, let's talk about basic wiring. This is to help do-it-yourselfers identify some of the things out there and have a little bit of comfort with what they're looking at. And remember, if you're ever unsure or just not quite good about what I'm telling you, there's always other expertise you can reach out to online. So don't ever forget, you still have the internet to double check what I'm telling you. All right, so we're talking about basic wiring. In the houses, in businesses, anything, you have wire, basic wire. And usually, except for some of the older stuff and some of the more commercial things, but you'll have copper wire. In here, you have 3 wires. The only difference here is the outside color of the plastic. Green for safety ground, red is your conductor, and white is your conductor. But usually white is considered a neutral, which is a return. So 3 different wires, 3 different colors for 3 different purposes, but it's basically the same thing. It's copper wire inside. Okay, how does this get run? You don't just put it in the walls just like that. What happens is you'll see it inside some stuff like this. This is some of the older houses or custom built houses and so forth. What I did in my house was I ran most of my stuff in here. This is metal. It's called flex or greenfield, depending on who you're talking to and so forth. And the conductors are inside it, just like this. In this case, you have 3 conductors: your safety ground, your neutral, and your hot. Okay, they run inside both ends, and they'll go into electrical boxes or whatever inside the walls. Again, this is kind of a high price installation, but very durable. All right. So what do we see now in basic houses and so forth? Well, they run it inside of a plastic sheath now. It's called romex. Romex comes in different sizes in wire. So let's talk about a little bit about wire size, or wire gauge. It's a gauge. It's referred to as a gauge, AWG, or just gauge. So in a house, you usually see a gauge of 14 gauge, 12 gauge, 10 gauge, 8 or 6, or so forth. So your basic outlets and light switches and so forth are going to be 14 gauge or 12 gauge. And what that means is the amperes that it can be connected to at the circuit breaker. You'll look at your circuit breaker panels and you'll see them labeled 15 amps, 20 amps, 30 amps, 40 amps, so forth. Okay, so for a 14 gauge wire, that's a 15 amp breaker. So just keep that in mind. That's for safety reasons. This 14 gauge wire is good for 15 amps. All right. Doesn't matter how many outlets you put at the end of it. Doesn't matter what you got connected to it. It's only good for 15 amps. So a lot of people think, well, I can run 10 outlets on romex. You can put whatever outlets you want on there. Follow your building codes and so forth. Remember. But the most that can come out of that breaker is going to be 15 amps before it trips. Okay, so you have what we call 14 gauge wire. You have 12 gauge romex for 20 amps. Same thing, just a different thickness. You can see them. Your black, your white, your safety ground, so forth, in the plastic sheeting. Okay, but just a different amperage. And then sometimes you can increase the amount of conductors in here for different applications, okay? If you recall, or if you have any knowledge on this, and we'll talk about panels here shortly, but in a circuit panel, you'll have 120 volt or 240 volt, depending. Your basic outlets are 120 volt. Your dryers, stoves, welders, and so forth are 220 volt. And I'll explain that here in a sec. Okay, so going back to your basic house wiring, say you have a ceiling fan and you want to wire the light and the fan on a separate switch, and you only want to run 1 cable in there instead of multiples. Well, you can get romex with 3 conductors, which means your safety ground is always there, not considered a conductor, but you have your neutral, and then you have 2 hots, 2 120 volt legs. So same thing, but now you have 2, so you can do your light and your fan. All right, this is romex. So it's 12 gauge. Or you can get it in the 14 gauge, okay? In this case, this one has 3 conductors. So this is called romex 12 3 conductor, or 12-3. So don't let those numbers confuse you, but you'll see a 12 and then a dash and a 3 because there's 3 conductors. So that way I'm trying to simplify these things, okay? The first one I showed you, which only has the 2 conductors, is 12-2. 2. So 12-2, 12-3. Depending on what you want, what you need to run, and so forth in the house. Okay. Without stripping it, this is all what you're going to see in the walls until it goes into electrical box. Okay. Now, for dryers, stoves, welding, and so forth, we have the big black dark outlets or whatever. You're going to need a thicker wire. 30 amps. You need 10 gauge. Okay. Now, again, I'm going to repeat. These are rule of thumb. You can go find gauge settings out there online. Okay. So here you have a 10 gauge wire for usually a dryer outlet. Okay. So this one here is 3 conductor, 10 gauge. So what do we call that? 10-3. So this is a 10-3 romex. You have 2 legs for the power, which equals 240 volts. 120 and 120 is 240. Okay. This is for like dryers, welders, and so forth. Okay. Now, if there's any questions here that you feel that I'm not covering or anything like that, feel free to email me at nowletsfixthis@gmail.com. But I think keeping this basic is going to get you through. Sometimes you need more power. Sometimes it's for a service entrance and you need 40 or 60 amps. Well, they do make it. Romex, this is 8 gauge. How many conductors? 1, 2, 3. Never count that safety wire. 1, 2, 3. This is 8-3. So this is Romex 8-3 with the ground. It can get thicker. So let's recover some of this stuff here. Wire gauge is basic wiring. In a house, you have 14 gauge, 12 gauge, 10 gauge, and some of the thicker ones. Look at the amperes that we're talking about. That's the breaker that should be feeding that type of circuit. So if you have 14 gauge wire, the breaker should be 15 amp breakers. If you have 12 gauge wire, you can go to 20 amps. Remember, rule of thumb, go to your electrical codes and find the details on that. But these are rule of thumb. As an electrician, this is what I go by mentally. All right, so moving forward, what we're going to do is we're going to talk on our next segments, or one of our segments, we're going to talk about how we use these in the house. We're going to we'll talk about the outlets and so forth. And again, if you feel that you have more questions, you can email me at nowletsfixthis@gmail.com. So we'll see you in the next segment.